Okay, welcome back. Mariska, there are a few questions.
Yes, no questions in the chat, but some questions in the mail. And the first question already was, I think, halfway your speech. And it is, what do we add to infinity?
Yeah, that's almost a trick question, because I can imagine that where the question comes from. But if you talk really about infinity, then there's nothing to add. Otherwise, it would be adding to infinity. There would be something in infinity which is not there, which is of course not the definition for infinity. But I can imagine that behind the question, and otherwise please ask it again, is if there is boundlessness, what is our role? How can we play our role in a right way? And actually, we are constantly expressing the boundless. And one idea is, of course, that we think most often also in limited periods in time. And if you think about this idea of eternity that goes into that idea of boundlessness, you can imagine that in eternity we will also be infinitely expressing everything, because there is no end to it. So we shouldn't look just as, also forget the limitations of our idea of life and what we can express in one life, because in eternity, well, there will be, also infinity from every being that expresses itself. So in a sense that is nothing, that won't even be a question anymore if we try to, and of course that's very difficult. I cannot say that I do, but at least try to understand this idea of infinity. Yeah, so I hope that helps.
It's a very grand idea.
Yeah, there's no idea grander than that.
Other question.
Yeah.
You had it about freedom in the freedom of thinking, and that's inside your head.
Yeah.
But expressing that thinking is not always free. And what for impact does that have on thinking?
Yeah. Well, and I will also come back to that in later parts, especially the third part, where we talk a little bit about the freedom of speech and of conscience. And actually, that's a very great limitation, because as we started with, there is this idea of interconnectedness. We are actually not separate beings. We are one humanity, for instance. And it also means that we can only grow if we grow with each other. And there is much more we can learn, of course, when everybody is also able to express him or herself. And we take that away when we start to limit, for instance, freedom of speech or freedom of conscience. And I think that's a very limited way of looking at progress. There are some people, you see in some countries that this is a problem, and I think it's really based on how do you call it? Onwetendheid, ignorance. Because they think that they will progress further if everybody just also thinks the same and thinks like them. And they might do that with the best motives. But that's why I say it's ignorance, because there is always a bigger idea. We talk about infinity. There's always a larger idea. There's always more to learn. And we can do that a lot of more efficient and faster if we also give people the freedom of speech and of conscience. And I will add something more to that, because there is also a misunderstanding that freedom of speech, that there is, it goes hand in hand with also that idea of responsibility, that idea of how to say, the onderscheidingsvermogen, the ability to distinguish between these 7 aspects of thinking, for instance, in yourself. And I think that's also something that is missing. And then I'm talking about the West, who is especially a propagator of this freedom of speech, but often without this idea of responsibility. And there you see that people forget that they also have a responsibility for others, not only for themselves, but also for others in every action and thought they do. And that especially when speech becomes hateful or against unity, this also has a very negative impact. So I don't want to imply that any West or East better, but they all have their limitations. But in general, I think freedom of speech, especially as seen from this point of view, from these also this responsibility, is a very important thing. It's also something that has been promoted from the start by the Theosophical Society from 1875, when there was not so much freedom of speech. And still a lot of also discrimination, men and women, and people from other countries, race, etc. Yeah. So.
Then I'll go to the last question.
Please. Yeah.
What can I imagine with the responsibility of, for example, a solar being who has a great sense of unity? Is there also free will there?
Like I said, I think the greater the evolution of consciousness, the greater the free will, and that's especially there for these cosmic beings that are, and actually their free will is enormous, but it's also because they have evolved further and further, it's aligned much more with nature than our free will, because we haven't yet learned how to distinguish between our personal free will. I will talk more about that also in the next parts. Our personal free will and the really spiritual will, which is aligned with nature, which is aligned with the whole. And I think that's something that you see with these higher beings, like solar beings, for instance, that they and sometimes, and this is really typically a human expression, we call them, they are slaves of the law. But actually it's just they're voluntary slave of the law, because they see what that in essence this law of nature is the best there is. It's compassion itself. So it's harmony. So they are they become agents of that. And I think that is by their free will is a very precious and interesting thing we can also be inspired by. Yeah.
Those were the questions.
Okay, thank you. Then we will go on with the next part. Based on the question, what is karma and how does it relate to free will? And we have already dwelt on the fundamental idea of the Theosophia in the first part, this unity of life. Now, if you really realize that unity, then it's only a really small step to the doctrine of karma. Now, many people misinterpret karma as something separate. They talk about your karma, my karma, or about good karma or bad karma, or something that comes from outside, like an inescapable fate, something that is already fixed, or the will of a god or of gods. But as we pointed out in the first part, free will is essential, especially if you assume that everything is, in essence, boundless. Now let's reflect again on that idea of boundlessness and the metaphor of the boundless ocean and try to relate that to karma. We said that every being can be seen as a wave in that ocean. And every being is only seemingly separate from that ocean. Because in essence, of course, each being is that ocean. So that also means that every being within the being has everything that is present in that ocean, as a potential. And that is also the foundation for free will. you could say we can form our own wave, our own ripple, each to our degree. Now each wave is inseparable from every other wave in that ocean. And karma can be properly understood only from this idea of inseparable interconnectedness of all beings with each other. Now every movement in that ocean of life affects every other life. And every cause we create thus has consequences not only for ourselves, but also for the total ocean of which we are a part. And that influence is of course greater for the life immediately surrounding us. But just as a stone in a pond creates circles that expand to the shore and eventually return to the place where the stone had its impact, so too do the consequences of our actions always return to us. But, and here a misunderstanding often arises, these consequences do not arise from blind force. They're nothing but the reactions of living beings who are also part of that living whole. And sometimes those reactions are immediately, sometimes they are delayed. Perhaps another comparison can clarify this further. Now in the first part we define peace or harmony as the right interplay of action and reaction in any situation. Now you can take the example of an orchestra. Again, it is very clear that the actions of each individual affect the harmony of the whole. And this example also indicates that cause and effect play out not only in the physical realm, but just as much in the emotional or mental realm, indeed in all areas of existence. To make good music you need emotion, you need self-control, you need an intellect to be able to read notes, for instance, understanding and insight into the piece of music, and also an eye and ear for the cohesion in the orchestra. Moreover, all these levels interact with each other. And just as in a concert the music is the sum of all the actions of all the orchestra members, the same is true of karma. And if you play a false note, it will not only affect the harmony of the whole, but will also evoke the reaction of fellow members and also the conductor of the orchestra. And vice versa, of course. If you play very consciously, cleanly, inspiredly, harmoniously, your orchestra members will gravitate to you and the conductor might let you play first fiddle, for instance. But not only the moment of performance determines the playing. And a snappy comment from one of your neighbors beforehand, for example, something that brings you out of balance for a moment, into which you do not know how to respond to immediately, the tension that was caused by it remains. And maybe as a professional you manage to put it off completely during the concert, but the tension will still work itself out afterwards. And there's another parallel we can draw with the doctrine of karma in a concert, because in life the recording is always running. Every thought, every action is recorded in the books of nature, and that nature is nothing but the sum total of all living beings that we are inextricably connected to. So let us dwell for a moment point by point on this doctrine of karma. Now literally, karma is Sanskrit for action. And it's also called the law of cause and effect. And the essence of it is that the characteristic of the consequence equals the characteristic of the action. It's also called the law of restoration of harmony. And like we said in the first part, for harmony you can also fit in peace or justice. Another brief explanation about karma comes in the words of one of Madame Blavatsky's masters. He said karma is Atma. And Atma, or Atman, is the divine self, or the self with a capital letter. The self that is fully one with the all. So karma, you could say, is an expression of our deepest self that is one with the whole. And karma is therefore essentially also the expression of free will. Because no action is possible, of course, without free will. And the consequences of our actions are actually also contained in the action itself. In short, this makes you look at your circumstances rather differently. It means you cannot blame anything or anyone outside of yourself for your circumstances, because they are all a consequence of free will. So karma is the continuous interaction of consciousnesses acting and interacting, each with their own degree of free will. But since all consciousnesses are essentially one, all karma is therefore, in a sense, ours. So, essentially, there is no my or your karma. And there is also no good or bad karma. Everything is karma. So this also means that you will never fall into the trap of saying it's all your fault, you have yourself to blame. Another misunderstanding that is often made about the doctrine of karma. Because if you assume one humanity, then someone else's karma is, in essence, also your karma. And if you assume one life, then the karma of any living being is also our karma. And that's easy to understand from this idea of unity. And what one person does concerns another. It's that simple. And it's this idea of unity in particular that has long been a lost thread in our Western culture, where individualism has been glorified for so long. But slowly but surely, this idea is being picked up again. Also thanks to science that is demonstrating in many ways how all life interacts and depends on each other, from ecosystems to the bacteria in our digestive system. Now we can increasingly observe this interconnectedness and reciprocity. And the next step is merely to assume that this connectedness and reciprocity is there even when we cannot observe it. For example, because the cycles we look at are so great that they transcend our own lives. And then we come to 3 types of karma. Now there's a lot of karma that we can observe on a daily basis. In fact, we do see immediate consequences of many of our actions. We set an alarm clock and it goes off at the set time the next morning and wakes us up. But the karma in our life also consists of consequences whose causes elude us. For example, because their origin lies in a former life. And this counts for everything that happens to us as something that appears to be beyond our control. For instance, where we are born, who our parents are, or the conditions of the world, and the time we live in, things like that. But if cause and effect occur clearly, and if there is interconnectedness in life, why shouldn't it have been this way before we were born? And this, of course, also applies to the future. Some of our actions seem to have no consequences. We seem to have no impact, or we seem to get away with something. But it's only illusion if you assume connectedness and reciprocity. During death, our consciousness only temporarily withdraws from this earthly realm. But at birth, we reattract all the living building blocks we left here, including the impressions we have imprinted on them. And we also will collect again all our bonds we had with people that we have been binding to in previous lives. So we do not just come into the world in this body, with this character by chance. We pick up where we have left off, and then reap the seeds we sowed in this and, of course, also in previous lives. Although, of course, there are seeds from past lives that this life cannot yet germinate, and which we will only reap in the future, when there is a suitable breeding ground for those seeds. But as we have indicated, karma is not a blind law. There is no coincidence. but there's also nothing outside of us that determines our lives. It is always a matter of interaction. How does the environment respond to our actions, and how do we to those of the environment? In short, we already described it as a continuous dynamic interaction of consciousnesses, acting and reacting to one another, each with their own degree of free will. And if we make certain choices in life, this can mean that something inside us changes, and consequently a certain balance shifts, so that all kinds of things suddenly seem to come at us, as if from nowhere. For example, if we realize, through more knowledge about nature and its laws, that our responsibility is much greater and broader than we thought it was before, then this may also mean that we are more likely to take responsibility when circumstances call for it. And if we show this more often, then we may suddenly be asked, for instance, for a job with more responsibility. And as a result, we then also suddenly have more to endure. But at the same time, we can also prove our intentions and also grow faster. We also call this accelerated karma. Think of it a bit like being a good team player on a soccer team. Because when you play with a view of the whole game, you will see earlier when certain openings arise. You take a certain responsibility by playing yourself loose, running into the free space, and then you will receive also the ball sooner. And now you can prove that you can do something with that by making a good action or pass to another player. Now what can we conclude from all this? I think some very essential things. Namely that karma always begins with free will. Our free will to develop towards inner growth, and that also means that karma always works from the inside out. And it means that both the people around us, as well as our circumstances, can be seen as a field for this inner growth. We can be seen as a kind of magnet, which, based on our inner state of consciousness, again, also think of these 7 characteristics, a magnet, a sevenfold magnet, that attracts in character also corresponding effects. And the people around us and circumstances can be seen then as the gates through which our karma works. And they are therefore also, you could say, a mirror of our character. Now in this regard, it is important to realize that both love and hate are binding forces. Again, this is easy to understand from the fact that thoughts are also living entities, as we have often discussed in previous lectures. And the thoughts that we give the most attention to, whether it be from love or hate, are also the most determinant of what we will attract. I think something to think about, especially if you dislike a certain politician, for instance. Now, how do we see this reflected in practice? We can recognize this, for example, in the lives of peacemakers or liberators, like Václav Havel or Nelson Mandela. Now, to take Mandela as an example, I think he hardly needs explanation. He was, of course, sentenced to life in prison during the apartheid struggle in South Africa, imprisoned on Robben Island for 30 years. He got released, became president, and through the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, among others, managed to ensure a peaceful transition to an Africa with equal rights for white and black. He wrote the following in one of his letters to his wife, Winnie, at that time. He wrote honesty, sincerity, simplicity, humility, pure generosity, absence of vanity, readiness to serve others, qualities which are within easy reach of every soul, are the foundation of one's spiritual life. Development in matters of this nature is inconceivable without serious introspection, without knowing yourself, your weaknesses and mistakes. At least if for nothing else, the cell, being imprisoned, gives you the opportunity to look daily into your entire conduct, to overcome the bad and develop whatever is good in you. Now, I mentioned this quote from Mandela for a number of reasons. First, it is a good example of what we called accelerated karma. Mandela followed his conscience, took responsibility, chose to act for a larger whole, and protested against the injustice in his country, even risking the death penalty. And even after his release and becoming president, many challenges came. And although no one is without faults, he managed to overcome many of them and maintained unity in his country. Also, these words of his clearly show that change comes from within. It all starts with our own thinking, our character. And he also shows that this way is inward, and it is an active way, something that also needs daily maintenance. And finally, it makes clear that we might refer to as bad karma. Think about being imprisoned for 30 years with no prospect of release, for example. It doesn't have to turn out as that bad after all. It shows what happens when we accept whatever situation and see it as an opportunity, a chance, a lesson. And you can even ask the question whether Mandela could have developed in this way without this imprisonment. Of course, I don't want to argue for imprisonment, but of course, it shows how we have to be careful about superficially judging certain circumstances as good or bad. There is no coincidence. We always end up in a certain circumstance based on previous thinking and acting, and with the right perspective, these can be exactly these circumstances we need to grow. So to conclude, you could say that karma teaches us that man always determines his own destiny, and that nothing outside of ourselves determines it for us, neither gods, nor chance, nor blind force. Nothing happens to us just like that. And we said in the first part that freedom is not so much something that comes from without, but much more something that arises from within. Now this may have raised the question in the first part, and what about our circumstances? Surely these are very decisive in determining how free we are. Now with the knowledge of karma, we can now conclude that those circumstances are not outside of us, because we are not separate from the whole. There's always connection. And the cyclical processes that allow the effect to follow a cause are sometimes larger than a human life, and then they elude our perspective. But of course they continue, just as the earth continues to spin as we, at death, release the outer body here on earth and enter our period of rest in the inner realms. So the future is not fixed, but you can only reap what you have sown. And this sometimes seems a bit unrewarding if we look at our circumstances now, but at the same time it is also the most hopeful. We can change our own destiny now, and the future is really in our own hands. And by in our own hands, we do not mean that we are solely responsible for our own lives. We said before, there's essentially no difference between your karma and that of another. And like Judge said, the karma of each is the karma of all. And not that we should assume the duties of others, but it is our duty to help remind others of their own responsibility. We can, however, inspire others to open up to the inner wisdom within themselves, which is essentially equal to the inner wisdom that we have experienced. And to the extent that we have opened ourselves to it, we are also able to inspire others with it. And in the next section we will go into more detail about how this works. Okay, we will again have a short break of 3 minutes and then again time for your questions and the third part. See you in a few minutes. Back. Mariska still busy with the chat.
Yeah, I found out that there were earlier some questions in the chat that I didn't see, so I start with those.
Yep.
The first question that was from the first period is brotherhood the same as unity?
You could say that those are indeed synonymous terms. But then we speak in Theosophy also as about universal brotherhood, universal brotherhood as a fact, because and then we mean brotherhood not only literally between people, but really as a brotherhood between every being, from the idea that every being has the same parent, the same source, and is related to each other. And so then you see that it's, well, you could say one family, and that's a way to express unity. So yes, in essence, those are synonymous terms. Yes, yeah.
The second question in the chat was, do I understand it right that free will is the ability to choose the highest that you know, because then you are unbound, not attached to the lower?
Well, we said free will is the ability to the inherent divine power to choose, and that means that it's not only limited to the divine, expressing the divine within ourselves, because the divine always expresses itself also when we are acting in a limited way. That is a bit paradoxical, but otherwise we couldn't do that. And so it means that actually the divine is the power behind every action. But of course, our will is in that sense more free, because we don't see that if we act in a limited sense, not from doing our best, that it looks free, but actually we are limiting ourselves, because karmically we are weaving ourselves in these consequences that we have to, that bring disharmony, that we have to bring in harmony again. While nature, if you see it from the whole, is always looking to express harmony. So yes, if we do our best, then we give a proper expression. We express our free will properly, but in essence, behind every action there is free will. So it's not only free. You cannot call it only free will if it's expressed from a divine point of view. No, it's also free will when we lift this glass or whatever we do, express a word. That we can do that without being limited by anything else in the cosmos shows that it's a divine thing, that we can always choose. And like I said, and this is not something that I said, but it's something that you find in the Theosophical literature, that the Baruch wrote, that even the minutest atom, the minutest particle, cannot be limited by the whole universe, the whole weight of the universe weighing in on that particle. There's always this, albeit a very small, limited way to choose within this minutest particle. So, and that's really the free will that is in everything. Yeah. I hope that makes it more clear. Yeah.
Still is a complex side.
Yes, I can imagine. Yeah.
I read out the next one. I think it's more a statement than a question. But someone said, the idea that your free will increases as your consciousness increases is quite a tricky one. And I don't know what he means by tricky, I asked, but he didn't elaborate on that.
Okay. Well, please do, because that also would be my question. Why do you think it is tricky? Because I think that it's maybe it could be tricky because there is this idea of false motive to grow, and that's why we also make clear that with greater expression of consciousness also comes greater responsibility. And I think that's something, especially when you look from that point of view, from unity, from brotherhood, from this interconnectedness, that is very clear. So it can be tricky if you still have not the right perspective and see yourself as separate from that. And well, there are many, of course, wrong examples. You see that there is competitiveness for knowledge, let's say in economic sense between countries, not so much for the greater good, but to be the richest country, for instance, to have the best economy. Well, we have to keep our talent and we have to focus on education for the right sectors where there are many jobs and we can grow and compete. And then it sometimes even becomes more important than becoming a good citizen and having a good democracy. And that's always you can see it also in that sense, that in that sense it's a tricky one. Yeah.
And now he explained.
Okay.
The
Well,
word
maybe
tricky.
I was. Okay.
He especially meant difficult, and I think we can agree on that.
Okay. Yes.
It's a very difficult idea to grasp.
Yeah.
Thank you for your extra explanation.
Well, it's really something to think about more. Yeah.
And I have one question in the mail. In the literature, we are told that we can become or be a co-worker of nature. How does that relate to karma and harmony? Yeah, I think that's really something that is in line with each other. As the workings of nature, there is this idea in Theosophy, we say the law of laws is really compassion. It's eternal harmony. And actually all these laws of nature, these doctrines we talk about, are aspects of this one law, this one dharma, this one how nature, the processes in nature work and interblend and intermix and work together with each other. So really karma is one aspect of that same teaching, that karma is also in essence compassionate. Everything that comes back to us helps us to realize this unity better. In essence, that because we get a reaction when we act from this illusion of separateness, we get a reaction to realize again, no, we are not separate, we are united. So, and actually that's a very compassionate idea, and that's actually also how nature works. Nature works by everything working for everything. And so I think that those are really, really strongly connected, these ideas. Yeah. These were the questions for now.
Okay, thanks. Then we will go to the last part. Now in the foregoing we considered the concept